Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elis Vllasi. I'm a lecturer in international security in the Department of Political Science here at Fraser University. We welcome you to this discussion organized by the Department of Political Science as well as the Nato Field School at SFU. Over the next 1.5 hours, I am honored to moderate this conversation between three different experts, Professor Luca Ratti, Professor Nicole Jackson, and Professor Alex Moens on a very unfortunate event, the war in Ukraine. Recently it was brought to my attention, or at least it kind of made me think a lot about land acknowledgements as the war in Ukraine is taking place over territory. So Fraser University respectfully acknowledges the unceded traditional lands and territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsalay, Huatuth, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam nations on which SFU Burnaby is located. And we are honored to be their guests on their land. About 30 years ago, an American political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, wrote a seminal book called The End of History and the Last Man. Almost to the T, 30 years ago. And in that book, he argues with the fall of communism and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, mankind has entered a new era, one in which there are no ideological divisions, and one in which you will have the universalization of Western liberal democratic values. The 1990s, the early 2000s were an era of optimism and an era where you had a lot of economic wealth, increasing freedoms worldwide, and an increasing share of democracies worldwide. However, since 2008, 2009, the Great Recession, if you will, we have seen not only a decrease in the share of democracies worldwide. Today, less than half of the countries in the world are democracies, but we have seen an increasing level of authoritarianism. According to Freedom House 2021 data, this year, or last year I should say, only about 20% of world's population lives in a free country. The 80% of the world's population lives in a country that is not free or partly free. These systemic changes that have taken place over the last 30 years, particularly over the last 10, 15 years, in large part can be ascribed to the rise of autocracies, not only in number, but also in terms of wealth and in terms of influence. And these autocracies are seeking to append the rules-based international order. So over the next hour or so, we will hear from three international security and regional experts as they unpack for us the global impact of the war in Ukraine. Today, we are honored to have a guest from across the pond, if you will, the Atlantic pond in this case, Professor Luca Ratti, an associate professor of history of international relations at the University of Rome III, an adjunct professor at the American University of Rome, and visiting professor at Carleton University. Professor Ratti's research and teaching interests lie in the post-World War II international history, specifically US and European relations, NATO's evolution, European security and defense policies, and international relations theory. Professor Ratti is an author of 3 monographs, 2 edited volumes, and several book chapters and journals, and he has written extensively for the International History Review, the Journal of Transatlantic Studies, Diplomacy and Statecraft, and many other renowned journals. Today we also have Professor Nicole Jackson, an associate professor and chair of the graduate studies at the School of International Studies here at SFU in Burnaby. She teaches and researches in the area of security studies, foreign policy analysis, and she concentrates in particular on Russia and Central Asia. Her first book was Russian Foreign Policy and the Commonwealth of Independent States, Theories, Debates, and Actions, which examined Russian ideas and debates over military involvement in Georgia, Moldova, and Tajikistan. Most of her research focuses on Russia's involvement in the post-Soviet space. We also have Professor Alex Moens, Chair of the Political Science Department and Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and the Director of NATO Field School. NATO-wide experiential learning program, that is, the NATO Field School is, that brings students from all across Canada, the US, and Europe to key NATO and international security and defense locations. Professor Moens is an expert on NATO and Canadian and American defense policy. He has authored and edited books and articles on Presidents Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush, American foreign policy, NATO, and transatlantic security. Without further ado, let's welcome our panelists. We will have Professor Luca Ratti as our guest start us off.
Thank you, Elis, and thank you everybody for organizing this and having me here, especially thank you to the head of the Political Science Department, Professor and friend Alex Moens. We met for the first time in 2008 at a conference on the Brussels Treaty Organization at a time when we were celebrating or discussing the prospect of maybe European nations taking up a bigger burden of security policy within a transatlantic space, and at a time when relations between the West and Russia were already deteriorating with the Russian intervention in Georgia in 2008. But I don't believe, or I don't guess that back in those days, any of us would have expected things maybe to turn that bad roughly 15 years later. So I will begin by providing like a very broad perspective on the global implications of what is happening in Ukraine, and then on the transatlantic implications of the Ukraine war, and finally I will move more specifically to a West European perspective, being exactly as Professor Vllasi mentioned, from across the Atlantic pond. Well, let me begin with a global perspective. I believe this is on the one side, as we mentioned Fukuyama, we can certainly mention maybe the alter ego of Fukuyama of liberal theory of international relations, and look at things from a realist perspective. For the realists, maybe what happened in Ukraine was the end of illusions, or maybe the illusions had ended already a while ago, but this was an additional confirmation that the hopes that the end of the Cold War will certainly spark a period of global harmony, maybe end of history, maybe collective security cooperation between nations were certainly misplaced, and that before or later traditional security conceptions between nations could bring about once again instability, will bring us back to the future in international relations, and will still somehow inevitably link the dynamics of international politics to the might of different great powers. So for the realists, this is a tough law of international relations, one that maybe was overshadowed by the joy that will link to the end of the Cold War, to the sense of relief that came with the end of the East-West division, roughly 30-something years ago. But it somehow overshadowed those that were the long-term dynamics of international relations. Well, I certainly do not need to go back to those dynamics, because I'm sure the audience knows them as much as I do, but let me go back at least to a conception of different ideas of security that maybe, from a liberal perspective, you could argue, inspire on the one side democracies, on the other side autocratic states, but which I believe are also partly linked to geopolitical considerations that cannot be necessarily related to the domestic forms of government or different societies. And let me start from a proposal, as we are looking at the global perspective, from the proposal that was formulated a few days ago by Xi Jinping at the Boao Forum, an official forum in China, of a new global security architecture in which somehow China articulated a vision that seems to call into question at least the idea of collective security, of an open international liberal security arrangements in which all nations, in a sense, could live in a globalized world. And it is a proposal that partly resembles also Russian ideas, that partly resembles the proposal advanced by Medvedev the last time in 2008, right before the Russian invasion of Georgia, or a pan-European security treaty. And it is a proposal that certainly partly reshaped. So partly is inspired by the draft security arrangement that Russia proposed to the United States and to NATO before invading Ukraine a few months ago. Here we have a conception of security that is certainly, we could argue, very realist from a theoretical standpoint. It remains absolutely state-centered, and it calls into question somehow the prospect that international organizations or the international community may come and interfere in the domestic affairs of states. So it is a proposal that is firmly rooted in a traditional interpretation of the United Nations Charter, one in which the ultimate role for managing international security belongs to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and one in which the organization does not interfere into the internal affairs of states, as argued, as clarified in Article 2.7 of the United Nations Charter. On the other hand, in June 2021, President Biden and British Prime Minister Johnson instead signed up to another key document, again, that may remind us to a different vision of the international system, a new Atlantic Charter that aims, in a sense, to rejuvenate the idea that inspired the United Kingdom and the United States right during World War II in August 1941, even before the American entry into the war, to discuss prospects of a different blueprint for the post-war international system, one in which international relations would no longer equate might is right, one in which the traditional realist logic of the balance of power that had been able even to contain the rise of Nazi Germany in Europe or the rise of Imperial Japan in the East could be redrafted, could be completely transformed, and one in which nations would trust one another and build upon an open collective security project. I think these two ideas, they certainly shape the evolution of the international system from the days of World War II up to the days of the end of the Cold War. And whereas Britain and the US in 1941 were dreaming of an open international system in which, as I said, collective security would become the bulwark of the new international rule, instead, the Soviet Union back in those days had a completely different idea. Maybe for those of you that are familiar with international history, you may remember that right after the signing of the Atlantic Charter between Roosevelt and Churchill, the British Foreign Minister Anthony Eden was dispatched to Moscow, and Stalin gave him a completely different vision of what Soviet security would be like, one in which blocks would be necessary to protect pretty much the Soviet Union or to protect Western Europe from the risk of new aggressions coming from a hegemonic power in Europe. The country was certainly Germany back in those days. But still a completely different idea in which openness would not be a guarantee of security, in which openness would actually only be perceived as a threat for state security. And certainly the experience of the Soviet Union during the 1920s, I think, heavily influenced the thinking of Stalin, and maybe still today heavily binges upon the thinking of Vladimir Putin. Let me say why. As you may know, the USSR was not a signatory to the Treaty of Versailles. As you may know, the USSR didn't participate in the Locarno Treaty or agreements that between 1925 and 1956 attempted to redefine European security. And as you may know, at the conference in Munich in 1938, when the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia began, no Soviet delegates certainly were invited. So we have here like a conception of the need for, be it the Soviet Union in those days, be it Russia today, to take security pretty much into its hands, because international organizations are unable to provide the collective security, but may actually end up undermining state security. It is a feeling that partly China has come to adopt itself, especially after consolidating itself in the structure of the Cold War and after being able to, let's say, liberate itself from Soviet influence, beginning in the mid-1950s and then moving on to establish itself as a rising power in international relations, at least from the early 1970s. Today we see a number of countries, not only Beijing and Moscow, somehow having found a new agreement on the need to restate state security against the prospect of an international system dominated by Western democracies. And to make a long story short, I'd like to say, as much as during the Cold War we had a non-aligned movement that refused to take a side between East and West, today we've seen reactions to the war in Ukraine from the non-Western world being much more mixed or fragmented than what we've been observing instead in Western Europe or in the West, with India taking a very unexpected position from a Western side and instead trying to deepen ties, commercial ties, especially with Russia, with the Arab world being substantially very cautious about embracing a pro-Western position, and somehow with Moscow being able to overcome the sanctions regime that the West has put in place to punish its illegal invasion, or as the Russians call it, special operation in Ukraine. So certainly here we have a global dimension that is pointing towards the end of that logic of the end of history, if there was ever any realistic hope that the logic could come true, to which instead the West, especially the Biden administration, has, let's say, responded, has replied with a very binary conception instead of the war, one between democracies and autocracies. Again, it's a vision that certainly works within the Western mindset, but that maybe is understood with a degree of skepticism outside of the West. Now, the second dimension instead that I like to tackle is the dimension of relations between NATO and Russia, so a transatlantic dimension. Let's say between, as we are in Vancouver today, Vancouver and Vladivostok, because there was an idea in the early 1990s that the end of the Cold War maybe would not bring about the end of history, but certainly could trigger a period of mutual engagement between the former Soviet bloc states. Many of those were very, very keen to enter NATO, to come forward with proposals somehow to be considered for NATO membership as early as 1990. Czechoslovakia, that still existed as a unitary state, Poland, Hungary, and on the other side, the West. So this was the idea. A time of engagement will now be possible, and the Russians will be reassured that certainly NATO was not an organization that never ever tried to undermine Russian security. And even Western Europeans, despite maybe rejoining that the end of the Cold War came to an end, would substantially prefer to keep the alliance in place rather than to dismantle it. And Margaret Thatcher, the then British Prime Minister, I think very cleverly pointed out to the fact that maybe you would be better off, despite the fact that burglaries are clearly diminishing in the last few years in one street, it would be better off to keep NATO as an insurance policy, whereas instead some West European nations, especially France, had different ideas and were thinking about the need maybe to reshape this transatlantic relationship and empower Europe vis-a-vis the United States. That was certainly a vision that appealed to Gorbachev, appealed to Yeltsin at the time of transition between the USSR and the Russian Federation, and not surprisingly, it would still have appealed to the Russians if the French elections for Sunday had gone maybe in a different, let's say, it ended up with a different result, with a result that maybe certainly Vladimir Putin would have preferred. But again, also the Russians very early came to be reconciled maybe with the idea that after all, disintegrating NATO and replacing it with an institution that was maybe too cumbersome, be it the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, maybe with an unclear purpose, with a new pan-European security institution, would not have benefited everybody. Especially at the time, I think this is forgotten very, very often, where Germany was being reunited. So think about NATO being disintegrated and a new united Germany without constraints on its foreign and security policy. I think that would have created significant anxiety in Moscow. So during the 1990s, we actually saw engagement growing between the two sides, be it the Partnership for Peace in 1994, be it the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997, before the doors of the alliance were opened to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in the first round of enlargement, be it the more famous NATO-Russia Council in 2002, when George Bush and Putin basically committed themselves to build a durable cooperation between the two sides. And at that point, I think Russia again toyed with the idea that maybe one day the Russian Federation itself would become a member of the alliance, maybe the alliance would be transformed to be, as the then Russian Defense Minister Igor Ivanov called it, a new anti-terrorist organization of which Russia would be a full member with a full say on the decisions of the alliance. But again, let me say this was certainly a track of relations between NATO and Russians But many issues that were left open at the end of the Cold War were unfortunately not solved during that period. So this, in a sense, should have led us to be more cautious about the prospect for durable cooperations between the two sides. And many of the fate of especially the former Soviet republics were left hanging in the balance, and this created, I would think, significant friction between the two sides. And especially when the prospect of NATO may be opening its doors not only to former Warsaw Pact states, but also to former Soviet republics, be it the Baltic states, be it later Georgia, be it Ukraine, became, let's say, a more realistic possibility. This is when the Russians certainly had hardened their stance. And the so-called colored revolutions that began in Georgia with the overturning of Shevardnadze in the early 2000s, move on into Ukraine with the Orange Revolution, I think they created an increased sense of anxiety in Russia and certainly contributed, let's say, to rekindle mutual distrust on both sides. The history of what happened after 2008 is unfortunately, I believe, very well known to everybody, and from my point of view, I believe this was substantially a missed opportunity. It was a missed opportunity for both sides, because both NATO and both the Russian Federation would have certainly benefited by building a more engaged relationship, and whereas the two sides were able to cooperate, things actually did go quite well. Let's not forget that Russia participated in a number of peacekeeping operations conducted by NATO in the Balkans. Russian forces were deployed in Bosnia alongside Ukrainian forces. They took part in the peacekeeping operations that was deployed in Kosovo, despite a small incident, with a quick Russian arrival in Pristina that even predated the arrival of NATO forces. So there was significant prospect on both sides to engage cooperatively, but both sides failed to solve some of the key issues left open by the end of the Cold War, be it the conventional forces in Europe issue, be it the issue of missile defense, be it the issue of NATO enlargement itself. And the end result was that the prospect of Russia getting closer to NATO was never actually pursued by any of the two sides. NATO never had maybe a clear-cut interest in transforming the NATO-Russia Council into something that would really be, let's say, a step before getting Russia involved into the organization, and the Russians themselves probably, they never developed a significant interest in joining the alliance. Think about the prospect of expanding Article 5 to the Russian borders at a time when turmoil in Chechnya hadn't been completely quelled, and you may certainly realize how complex that prospect would have been. Maybe as a former US Secretary of State, James Baker, once spoke about this idea of a collective pan-European agreement. This was an excellent dream, but only a dream or an illusion, to go back to a realist conception of this. And then let me go back to the third level of analysis, which is like how Western Europeans reacted to the war in Ukraine. And I think Western Europe has probably been very careful to nurture its relationship with the Russian Federation. And when Mikhail Gorbachev in 1986 for the first time spoke about the need of creating a common European home, whereas the Anglo-Americans replied to Gorbachev, well, there are too many walls in Europe to consider it a truly common European home, Western European nations were very volcanic. The Germans, the French themselves, but also the Italians, the Spaniards. So we've had here a long tradition of policy of coupling up together deterrence against the Soviet Union and Russia with the need for dialogue. It is a tradition that certainly goes back to the time of the great detente in East-West relations to the 1960s, and it is a tradition that is being driven alternatively, first of all by France. Let's not forget how much de Gaulle went out of its way to build dialogue with the Soviet Union, and similarly, let's not forget how much Macron tried to build in the last few weeks before the conflict on an attempt to avoid the Russian invasion Ukraine, but certainly is a tradition that has been carried out first and foremost by Germany, the country that has come, let's say, into their main target of accusation by Ukrainians for having been too soft towards Russia, especially during the 1990s. And the alleged decision by the Ukrainian government to reject a visit by the former German foreign minister and current president of the Federal Republic, Franz-Walter Steinmeier, to Kiev a few weeks ago, I think tells us a lot about how Ukraine and Western Europeans may have perceived things differently towards Russia for a few years. Despite this, I have to say that certainly the Russian invasion has rekindled instead unity among Western Europeans on the need also to rely on a very tough policy of deterrence and defense. So rather than only deterrence and dialogue, to emphasize the defense aspect of the transatlantic relationship. So we have seen a commitment in the last few weeks by most of West European members of NATO to support Ukraine, not only in humanitarian terms, but also like through the delivery of weaponry. And countries that traditionally were, let's say, more reluctant to engage in a robust way against Moscow, countries that are traditionally dependent upon Russian energy sources have instead taken, let's say, a very robust approach, including Italy, partly including Germany itself, including France, and partly, I would say, including also the Netherlands. Now, my long-term doubt will remain how sustainable this drastic approach towards Russia is, and how much appetite there is in Western Europe for seeing the prospect that a prolonged military effort in Ukraine will not only avoid the subjugation of a sovereign state on the Russian side, but should lead, as the US Defense Secretary Austin made it clear today, like in Kiev, in his visit to Kiev, to a significant weakening of Russia that could have certainly long-term implications also for the security of the Russian Federation. So I wonder to what extent Western Europeans will be willing and ready to face the threat posed by Russia, and in a sense to rise up to the challenge that is certainly unprecedented for European security since the end of the Cold War, if not since the Cold War itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ratti. Next, we have Professor Nicole Jackson.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Moens, for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be on this panel and to be with all of you to discuss some of the many global ramifications and local ramifications of this horrific war. So what I am going to look at is a little bit different, right? Maybe than some of you see kind of in, I guess, everyday news. I'm interested in the ramifications of this war on the former Soviet region. And what does that mean, or how can we think about what that might mean for Russia's role in this particular region? So by this I mean, think back when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, 50 newly independent states emerged. So we're talking about very, very different countries, right? We're talking about the Baltics, which, as we all know, have been incorporated very quickly into the European Union and NATO. We're talking about Ukraine and Moldova and Belarus. We're talking about the Transcaucasian states, and I'm talking about the 5 post-Soviet Central Asian states. So the 15 countries that make up what we used to call the post-Soviet region. Now, of course, each country in this region is unique. And before the war, they all had their own complex and evolving relations with the Russian Federation. Yet Russia had been the main provider of security of much of this region, not all, obviously, and a key source of trade and remittances for many of these countries. So I think that the ramifications in this war are significant, and it's important to talk about them. And they may not just be short term, but they may be enduring or consequential. And we may be seeing the unraveling or the further unraveling of this region and the many sub-regions within it. And we may be seeing the consolidation, on the other hand, of one particular section of this region. So to begin, I'll also try to place what's happening in this former Soviet space, or what Putin wants to call Eurasia. A lot of people call Eurasia. I'll try to put it within a global context. And I think it's important because I think that the trends that we see, right, in post-Soviet region fit within these global trends that predate the war in Ukraine and that are exacerbated, in some cases very greatly exacerbated by it. So here I'm thinking about the intensification of great power rivalry, which if you look in this particular region, right, it's already existed between the so-called West and Russia and China and some other countries. The contestation over global order that you've talked about, right? We just heard about, which has a long history. Growing multipolarity, even if it's the case that the European Union and NATO and North America have kind of been greatly strengthened and united in response. Other global trends that predate this war include the continued fragmentation of the global economy, right? And now we see the greater Russian isolation from the West in particular. Increased migration and refugees. This was already happening in this region and elsewhere, but in this region from Afghanistan, from the Middle East, now obviously from Ukraine. Food insecurity, which affects Afghanistan in particular, right? Which neighbors the Central Asian countries. Energy insecurity. So we have global food and energy prices soaring, and these affect even rich energy states like Kazakhstan, which depend on Russian infrastructure for trade and transports. And then, of course, there's also the real concern that we're witnessing further erosion of so-called global norms that we can talk about, and that there are different contestations, again, of the visions of the global order that you just heard about. Of course, when we look into the future, and we're trying to think about Russian soft and hard power in the future in this region, I have to begin by saying it will depend on, number one, exactly what happens on the ground in Ukraine. So how much longer this war goes on, what happens to Russia's military, which has already had many setbacks, and that will affect, right, or exacerbate the global trends that I've just mentioned. So we can talk about this later, but for example, if Putin managed to hold on to parts of the Donbass, or the south, we could speculate that Russia might more likely have a greater role, right, in some areas in the former Soviet space, but right, the devil is in the details here. Number two, ramifications will depend on economic effects of the war and future sanctions in Russia and what it means for these other countries. So how badly Russia is hurt, how long the sanctions will be kept, right? How long this unity we can have over keeping these sanctions, right? How long it will continue, how Russia and other states will respond. So if Europe, for example, right, takes these steps to eventually cut off Russian energy, right? It depends how fast this happens. Will Russia, for example, be able to switch energy supplies to Asia, right? How quickly can it do it? What will happen to Russian businesses if it's pushed, as they are pushed out of the West and they try, for example, to cater more to domestic customers and so on. And some experts, of course, believe that if Russia manages to control some of the areas in the Donbass or the south, that it will be well positioned to leverage or to have leverage over a significant share, not just of Ukrainian commodities, but of global commodities, of food, of fossil fuels, and of strategic minerals, which lie in those areas and which sometimes we think lie in those areas and in the Black Sea. Third, Russia's role will depend on political and information effects of this war. So speculating how long Russia will be politically isolated from the West. We know they've been kicked out, right, of various forms and so on. And of course, what happens to Putin and to his regime, which we can talk about. And then finally, the ramifications would depend on which country you look at and whether it's short or long term. Like, this is a very diverse region, and it's very important. I don't have time here, but to give agency to each one of these countries and the peoples that live in these countries. So what can we then say? I think you can say that there are some effects that we can talk about, excuse me, within the last 2 months of the war on this former Soviet region. So I can talk a little bit about economic effects, political and societal effects, and security effects that stem from this war in the last 2 months. So economic effects, you know, I'll try to put this in a nutshell, but if we start with Ukraine, we all know that, right, there's been this extraordinary humanitarian catastrophe, and that has repercussions on how Ukrainians, right, feel about Russia. There have been 5 million plus refugees from Ukraine, and more than that displaced. But the economy and the infrastructure has been crippled, the environment destroyed. The World Bank estimates that there's been a loss already of approximately 45% of the GDP. And all this has far-reaching global implications on agricultural production, because so many countries rely on Ukrainian wheat and grains. Ukraine and Russia make up 30% of the global export of wheat, 20% of corn, 75% of sunflower, and so on, right? The World Food Program, it's now been, right, said many times in the news, buys about 50% of its grain from Ukraine. But also there's implication of hydrocarbon extraction, mineral exploitation, as I said, and obviously future, we can speculate about future production and investment. If we look quickly at Russia, and I'm not an economist, but I read a lot about from Russian economists and other Western economists, right? Russia's obviously very harmed, but there are a lot of unknowns. So inflation is up, the ruble is down but stabilized. Western companies have, you know, obviously pulled out of Russia. There's been trade disruptions. I could keep going, right? We're now talking about possible default, and what does that mean on a $75 billion debt? Russia's already used up approximately half of its very large 640 billion currency reserves, right, in gold and foreign currencies. Consumer prices have risen by 17% in the last year. There's been acceleration of brain drain, right, out of Russia. We have approximately 200,000, I think, Russians now that have left the country, but this affects former Soviet region. I mean, the numbers I've seen, about 40,000 have gone into Armenia that are tech workers, for example. On the other hand, right, Putin would claim that the so-called, what he calls economic blitzkrieg from the West has largely failed. You know, we could discuss why this is, but partly because Europe's energy prices still bring in $800 million a day into Russia. Okay, and this is all fast moving, so we'll have to find out what's going to happen next. If you look at some of the other countries then in the former Soviet states, it's also a mixed but negative picture, with many currencies affected because they're tied to the ruble, rising inflation, increasing food and fuel costs. That was already happening, but they've been exacerbated. Another trend that's been exacerbated by the war. And, you know, there have been protests, for example, in places like Kazakhstan because of this before the war. So we can safely assume that some of the countries that are very dependent on Russia, like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan for remittances, you know, are going to be increasingly harmed. There's already signs that there's going to be increasing unemployment and anticipated spillovers that affect obviously not just this region, but many other regions in the world, the Middle East, Africa, and so on, in terms of tourism and trade and investment and the very high price of energy. And remember, these countries, several of them, the energy-rich ones, right, dependent on Russian ports and pipelines also to get out. And then I should say that also China's One Belt, One Road, some of its projects, infrastructure projects, for example, railroads, have been put on, right, hold also during this period. So what does that mean for Russia in the former Soviet space? Russia has to navigate economic effects and uncertainty. If it holds on to the Donbass, for example, it might have some leverage over Ukraine's resources. In general, countries that are dependent on Russia, like Armenia, Belarus, which itself is sanctioned, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, right, will still be dependent largely on Russia. The larger kind of Putin project of creating a Eurasian Economic Union as opposed to the, European Union is obviously not so viable if Russia can't kind of help generate growth. And Ukraine is obviously firmly, right, joining the European Union, and Georgia and Moldova are very strongly leaning this way. So, just in the quick 2 months, we can talk about what might happen later. Russia doesn't look so economically attractive, right? It's kind of soft power is diminishing. So very quickly, my next few minutes, I'll talk about the war's political, information, and societal effects, okay, on the former Soviet space so far. So Russia, I'm not going to say much, but right, Putin's still in control, even if he does seem isolated. And with the war, the trends towards authoritarianism, right, have been accelerated. This was already happening, so there's a further acceleration of authoritarianism that I'm happy to talk about later. And of course, as more information trickles in about Ukrainian human catastrophes and the different military mistakes and the sinking of Moskva and so on, and Russian soldiers are returning dead, I think there will be some repercussions obviously on his leadership, but these are unknown at this time. In the former Soviet space, however, we see, I'm making big generalization now, but an increase in the degree of regime's alarm and outright fear about Russia's aggressions and its intentions. Now, this again isn't new, right? They've had to balance kind of how they feel about Russia since 1991, right, when the Soviet Union broke up. But they have been growing, especially since Russia's annexation in 2014, and then this very brutal assault. And you can see that if you listen to regimes' kind of narratives about their wars and their statements and their abstentions at the UN Security Council and so on. But they range from Belarus, which, as you know, and here's another trend of the war, has effectively lost its sovereignty. It was moving that direction anyhow, and supports Russia's involvement in the war. And on the other side, Russia's kind of strongest critics, which would be the Baltic states, which are obviously sensitive to a whole variety of Russian encroachments. The other countries, basically use careful language or are silent. They don't condemn, they don't support, but this, it depends which one, again, we're talking about. So Georgia and Moldova, of course, are trying to join the European Union. They're careful not to provoke too much. Russia, if we talked about Armenia, it's dependent still on Russia in many ways, right? 90% of its arms comes from Russia. It's involved in a conflict, right, with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. So it avoids the issue, right, what political scientists call kind of strategic shirking. Central Asian states, more authoritarian and, very adept at pursuing their so-called multi-vectored policies. Happy to, still try to pursue Western investment and so on, but have strong ties with Russia. Again, they're variable, and are happy that Russia doesn't critique its, their domestic politics and their human rights and so on. I think the longer the war goes on, the more pressure some states will be to take sides, and that's of course the ones in the West again, but not only. At the societal level, however, these populations have quite different perceptions, and most of them have been pushing the regimes to take a stronger pro-Ukrainian stance, to send more humanitarian aid. There have been protests in different places in Georgia and Kazakhstan, for example. And I think there's real question about how the regimes deal with these issues and how they manage influx of refugees, for example, especially in Moldova, right, which is closest to Ukraine, but also Georgia, what they do with foreign fighters that have gone off to fight on different sides and will be coming back. And all these are effects of war, and they come at the time when regimes were already facing a lot of societal pressures for change, which are real. So what does that mean for Russia's role in the former Soviet space? I think it will continue to pursue a range of ties with these states. They may find, right, pursuing those ties will be more and more difficult than they had before. There's likely to be more polarization in certain countries, right, and between the Russia and the West. I'm thinking again, Georgia and Moldova. Some authoritarian regimes, we'll have to see, might feel their power more threatened. Again, the ones in Central Asia, at different times from society, and it's possible that they look, right, more towards Russia and China. But it's also possible, right, that they are instituting reforms, for example, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and then that continues, right? We'll have to see. So number 3, effect of the war on regional security. Since the war in Ukraine, Russia has remained militarily involved in what used to be called frozen conflicts in Moldova and Georgia. So it has military in Transnistria and Moldova, and in Georgia and Abkhazia. It has military bases in Central Asia, in Tajikistan, where China now also has a small base. It has peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh, right, between Azerbaijan and Armenia, the conflict there. So a lot of people are watching to see what happens with the military that's stationed in those countries. And of course, it has now military in Belarus. And one of the questions is, as Russia retreats, right, will it leave what it was calling before kind of military exercises? Will it leave its military still stationed in Belarus, or what will happen there? Some of the troops recently have been reported to have been moved, right, in this kind of second wave of the conflict into Ukraine, but I'm not sure there what's real and what the numbers are. We know that the army, for example, in Transnistria, in Moldova, has not acted yet, but Russia is, right, making moves, trying, many setbacks, but it's been trying to create a corridor, obviously, between Crimea and the Donbass, and maybe further, right? There's been this threat about all the way to Moldova. Putin's kind of project to create what he had hoped to be at one point the equivalent of a NATO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, right, has not acted, right? It's not this is not a multilateral invasion. But I have to say that before this invasion, it did respond to the Kazakh government's help to quell protests, right? So call for Russia help to quell protests, which led to speculations about quid pro quo and Kazakh sovereignty. And I thought it was interesting that a month earlier than that, the CSTO's charter was changed to allow it to send peacekeepers to UN missions, right? Prompting some to consider whether this was done in anticipation of the current war, and to allow Russia eventually to send so-called peacekeepers, right, into Ukraine, which it has in all the other conflicts. And that's usually what I talk about, is the history of all the other conflicts. What else? We also have reportedly a growing number of foreign fighters going to fight on both sides. I think I mentioned that, but from Chechnya, a few, right, from the Middle East. Russia has also sent in mercenaries from kind of the Wagner Point 2 or La Liga group, right, which have been used also in Africa, in Mali, and Central African Republic, and Syria, and so on. So what does all this mean for Russia's security? I think it's possible that some states actually take advantage of what they now think of a more weakened Russia. For example, Azerbaijan in the conflict with Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia, even if weakened though, and it has been, but may be emboldened to take a more aggressive stance where it does have troops, and the status of these independent de facto independent states may be contested. So the big question is what will happen to these troops again in Moldova and Georgia, and what happens with these new dividing lines, right, that have just maybe shifting over as they want to move into the European Union. Russia might act on its renewed, it's not new, but threat to place nuclear and now hypersonic weapons or missiles in Kaliningrad, which is between Poland and Lithuania, that they threaten that they will do if Finland and Sweden join NATO. I think regional security alignments in the Central Asia area were already in flux, and maybe they are even more so. And we can talk about that, right? They have been since the increasing role of China in Central Asia, and especially with the withdrawal of the United States in Afghanistan. So I do think, right, as Russia is cut off from some countries in the West and Japan and so on, it will look more to some of these countries in the former Soviet space. And it's already been, before the war, it was already moving east in some ways, and developing other global ties too. One organization to watch, I think, is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, right? Where the question is, will we see more competition or cooperation So I'll finish up now and just say, I'll talk about SCO if you want in the questions, but to conclude, I think that the global trends that I began by looking at have been greatly exacerbated by the war. They're increasingly affecting the former Soviet region. The future depends on the several unknowns that I mentioned, but they will be consequential and they'll shape Russia's role within it. And while the ramification in European security orders is significant, as we heard, and there's been increasing amount of spending and strengthening of NATO, the former Soviet space is probably more divided than ever. The states and the populations are more apprehensive about Russia's intentions. And for many ways, Russia is, for now, economically and politically less attractive than it was in the war. But despite some dramatic setbacks, it still has, right, some significant, right, ties, hard power, and some real allies.
Thank you very much, Professor Jackson. The first one is, what's the cause of this war? The cause of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The second point is, why is there a stalemate today? And the third point, what's the trend, the apparent trend out of this stalemate? And point number 4, what is the spillover of this war on the international system? 4 short points, I hope. First, what is the cause? How do you explain the cause? You can think of 3 pictures. You can think of an image where you say, I'm going to focus on Vladimir Putin. And when I look at Putin, I see him as the cause. Why? Well, his popularity in Russia is waning. And he knows from experience that in Chechnya 2 times, and in Georgia, and in Ukraine, and in Syria, that when he stages a foreign war, his popularity goes right up. You could take a second picture and say, no, I want to look at the trend of society, the trend of Russia's society and the environment in which Russia is the neighborhood. A societal level picture. And what you get there is that since the end of the Cold War, about 100 million East Europeans have moved into the European Euro-Atlantic zone of EU, prosperity, trade, students going abroad, and security under NATO. And Putin is not really the key actor, but the societal trend around him is putting all this pressure on him. The pressure of 2 uprisings in Ukraine. The pressure very recently in Belarus, where he felt he had to step in because Lukashenko couldn't do it on its own. And of course, the surprising revolt in Kazakhstan. So basically, the societal picture says, look, the time is ticking. This trend, people want it in Ukraine. And they want it more and more and more. And eventually, they're going to want it in Moscow. Therefore, you have to act. And it also helps to understand that just acting in the Donbass isn't going to change the picture. You have to be big, go big, take Ukraine. Stop the trend. The third picture is a international relations picture. The picture of what great powers do. And it says, look, don't worry about Putin, don't worry about societal pressures. The real thing is, great powers don't die in their bed. You know, the Soviet Union ended in 1991, it became Russia, but that wasn't really the end. And NATO has been enlarging, coming closer and closer, and a great power wants a buffer, and the Russians are losing the buffer, and therefore they need more power by controlling more territory to avoid being overtaken by other great powers, of course the United States especially. This is the argument you've heard from people like John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt and so on. So that's my first point. 3 pictures. I wonder if any of you want to discuss them. My second point is the stalemate today. You know, if you think about negotiations, and think about it for a moment, not just as the Ukrainians are in the middle of this horrendous war, but think of their background. So the OSCE, which Russia is a signatory to, does make this kind of action completely illegal, as does the UN Charter, of course. But also Russia signed the Budapest Memorandum, in which it's guaranteed the sovereignty of Ukraine if Ukraine gave its nuclear weapons back. And Russia signed the Russia-NATO Founding Act. All of what Russia is doing is illegal by Russia's own signature for decades. So you tell me, what kind of treaty should the Ukrainians trust with a Russian signature on it? So it's hard to imagine what kind of negotiation can end this. Now, if you look at the military side, I think it seems to us now, and everybody was surprised of course, but it seems today now that Russia cannot really win, but it can sure wreck Ukraine. And every day it's trying to wreck more of Ukraine. Now, Ukraine can defend itself, but it cannot really push Russia out. And that's why we have this stalemate on the battlefield that is leading me into my third point. The third point is, what's the current trend? Well, I see the climate of caution on the side of the United States and NATO and the EU weakening, lessening. The United States is becoming less cautious about helping Ukraine, about sending stuff to Ukraine. In the beginning it was, oh, it can't be offensive, it has to be defensive, can't have MiG-29s. Now, the Americans are most likely involved in enabling airplanes to get to the Ukrainians, as well as heavy equipment of all kinds. And when, as Luca mentioned, when the two representatives in Kiev today or yesterday said Russia ought to be weakened, that's a big statement. So the Americans are less worried than they were in the last week of February, in the first couple of weeks of March. What are they doing? I think they're trying to tip the balance of stalemate. They're trying to actually tip the whole thing so that Ukraine can not only stop the Russians, but perhaps even move them out of the Donbass, maybe even completely, which of course is quite audacious. As often is the case with NATO, when push comes to shove, it's individual NATO members that do stuff. It's called coalitions of the willing, except this time the Biden administration wisely isn't doing that. It's wisely trying to get everybody agreed, everybody on board. But there's 4 or 5 allies that are really doing a lot. And the Brits, of course, are the second one after the Americans. My last point is, what is the spillover effect of this war on international politics in the immediate run, the immediate future? I think it is enormously deepening and articulating the strategic competition between the dictatorships, Russia, China, the tyrannies, and the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, etc. The loose group of Western liberal constitutional states. It's really making that very intense because China has given free rein to Russian official news broadcasting in China. And China has given free rein to Russian social media in China. So the Chinese people are being influenced very considerably, very significantly, consistently to understand the Russian side. I think it's very significant. And the Chinese, despite their wanting to have us doubt a little bit where they really stand, are in fact supporting the Russians. And the Russian-Chinese ties are closer, not weaker. What does that mean? Well, that means that the United States, which is of course relatively less powerful than it was in 1945, relatively less powerful than it was in 1991, I say relatively, not absolutely, but relatively. Now the United States and NATO, certain allies more than others, and the EU, and as Luca said, probably that is not going to necessarily last very long. This grouping has to now contain not only Russia, but also China. Now, 5 years ago, we said containing China is a ridiculous idea. Who would ever talk about containing China? But you know what? What's the alternative? If there is this kind of competition, they're going to try to contain each other's movements. But that's a rather unstable situation of a relatively less America trying to contain such a huge thing. So the instability of international politics, in my view, has greatly increased as a result of this war. And the risk of conflict, because, my last comment, the Chinese, who are very astute at understanding American power in all its dimensions, the ideological, the resources, the economic, the trade, the financial, they realize that American power is declining, but the one that is declining less quickly than the others is its military power. And I think the Chinese caution about Taiwan is entirely based on the fact that they know that they need 5 to 10 years before they can actually not be greatly damaged by an American-Chinese war. Otherwise, they will be tremendously damaged in such a war, because that is one of the aspects of the United States that's still most powerful, is its military sharp end, which is what Russia is finding out now indirectly. So, but that's a small window, short window. So, there we go, done.
Thank you, Professor Moens.